Kia ora Tefano, it's Lieutenant Lyle here with another History of the Far Future. We're going to get straight into it today. Today we are talking about one of the most interesting characters in the Heresy from my perspective. He's an Ultramarine, but he has so much depth and I think he's super interesting. We're talking about Aeonid Thiel. And on the historical side, we are talking about one of the great Prime Ministers of Britain and wartime leaders, Winston Churchill. What unites them? Well, it's actually kind of heresy. Both of these characters looked at how to defeat their supposed allies and what that meant for their respective armies, nations, alliances. So, with that said, let's get straight into it and cue the music. Let's start with the history. It's May 1945. The result of the Second World War kind of looks inevitable at this point. From the west, you've got the British and the Americans. In the east, you've got the Russians coming through and racing to Berlin, reclaiming as much of the territory in the Allies' name as possible. There's a conference in Yalta between the big three. You've got FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin meeting to decide the future of Europe in a post-World War II era. Winston Churchill's suspicious of Stalin, and as a result, he comes up with a plan, or commissions a plan, called Operation Unthinkable, which is really intended as a strategy to enforce a more favorable position in post-war negotiations or impose the will of the Allies on the Soviet Union should they continue to expand their influence in Europe. The Russians put a huge amount of lives into the Second World War, and at the point at which the war is coming to an end on the 1st of July, the Russians severely outnumbered the Allies in terms of people on the ground. Really, the only area that British and the Americans outnumbered the Russians was in strategic aircraft. Otherwise, it was almost 2-to-1 in terms of soldiers on the ground. This made Churchill nervous, and despite relying on the Russians to get to a favorable outcome in the Second World War, his trust was starting to erode. To be honest, this wasn't a really popular opinion back home in the UK or across the Western world, where Stalin was kind of favorably seen as Uncle Joseph coming to the rescue of the rest of the Allies during the war. The plan's initial strategic goal was to assert control over Poland, countering Soviet dominance as the war was coming to an end, and the plan contemplated a surprise attack on Soviet forces stationed in Germany and Poland to push them back towards the original Russian border. This plan involved British, American, and Polish forces even rearming some of the German soldiers that had been defeated and turning against the Russians, not as a first option, but it really is a backup, as we don't know how this is going to unfold, so we need to have a backup plan. Fortunately, the plan was scrapped. Churchill was voted out of Parliament, and the new Labour government scrapped the plans kind of day one. So thankfully, the war ended where it did. It was kind of the start of the Cold War straight away, and it's hard to say whether that's a result of the untrusting nature of the Brits, but it really stood as a legacy reflecting kind of the tensions between the Allies at the end of the war and the distrust that Churchill had of the Soviets in securing political objectives, even if he had to use military force to get there. So it remains as an intriguing what if, but very interesting to know that that was part of one of the contingencies or the plans coming out of the Second World War. Let's jump into the 40k setting, another one here based in the Horus Heresy. I just love the depth of some of these characters and some of the Space Marines that you see during the 30k setting. Aeonid Thiel was kind of just a line sergeant within the Ultramarines, but the Ultramarines were really known for their theoretical and their practical. So what is the theory for this engagement, and practically how is it going to play out, and those don't always match up. During the Great Crusade, Aeonid Thiel had run through all of the eventual practicals. He knew how most of the Xenos enemy or the human non-compliant enemy were going to react, and he was kind of getting bored. So, what did he do? He started thinking about how would he fight back against other Astartes. At this time, that was heresy. There was no such thing as Ultramarines fighting any other Space Marines. It was considered ridiculous. And for that, when Aeonid Thiel got found out, he was marked with the red helmet of censure. Today, in the 40k setting, we think of the red helmet as a sign of leadership. Squad leadership, typically sergeants, it's not just to sell you red paint, it marks out the leader of the squad. But at this time, it was seen as a mark of shame, as a mark of somebody who had done something wrong and was getting punished for it. So, Aeonid Thiel kind of bought this, was marked with this helmet, and at the time of the word bearers turning against the Ultramarines in the Segmentum Ultima, Thiel was actually on Guilliman's ship, awaiting an audience with Guilliman to be disciplined for his heretical actions, or his heretical planning at least. When the word bearer's surprise attack caught all of the Ultramarines off guard, he was actually hanging out in kind of Guilliman's private quarters, and he figured he was already in trouble, so he was using some of Guilliman's melee weapons to practice and thinking about various ways to fight off other Space Marines. Eventually, he's vindicated. The word bearers had turned on the Ultramarines, and there's an extended battle in Calth where countless lives are lost, but countless lives are also saved because of Aeonid Thiel's actions. He very quickly learned that the standard issue bolt guns weren't going to be as effective against other Space Marines, simply because their bolts weren't powerful enough to break through Space Marine armor. He also found out that melee weapons were more effective against warp creatures, against demons, and so from that you see him breaking chapters down into smaller units, more melee weapons, and fighting kind of in the hand-to-hand brutal style that we're used to seeing out of Space Marines right through to today. Post-heresy, Thiel was instrumental in reforming and revising the battle doctrines of the Ultramarines. He actually had a suit of armor that he kind of scratched various parts of what would become the Codex Astartes. Basically, the various tactics and kind of skirmish-based warfare that we see now in the 41st millennium, he started to pioneer back here. And to give credit to Reboot Guilliman, he takes some of that on. He looks at it and says, okay, maybe we're not doing everything right here. We've got to rethink things. And it becomes the Codex Astartes, which still is seen as scripture in the 41st millennium. Just an ordinary line sergeant has a lot to take credit for from that side. Aeonid Thiel is really seen as a critical thinker in an army of Ultramarines that is fairly standard. There's not much challenging assumption, questioning tactics or ways of operating. He out as an example of how critical thinking and preparedness for unthinkable situations can really lead to survival and victory. That worked not only at the betrayal of Calth, but extended through to the Codex Astartes, which we still follow today in the 41st millennium. A lot of chapters too, anyway. Thiel's character and achievements really exemplify the theme of innovation within the constraints of tradition, which is kind of a recurring motif in the 40k lore and highlights kind of that dynamic tension between order and adaptation, and actually is mirrored even in the modern setting with a lot of what Guilliman's doing today as he's come back and he's learning to adapt to a much more religious as opposed to secular society, and how to operate within that and the confines of the Imperium. Let's reflect on both the historical and the 40k setting and think about what we can learn going forward. Winston Churchill was voted out pretty quickly after the initiation of Project Unthinkable, and his plan never came to light. Thankfully, For all of us in the generation that had lived through the war, the Cold War stayed cold, and we're still here today. It was much different in the 40k setting. Thiel's impact was massive. It was the basis of the Codex Astartes, which has really formed a doctrine that continues through to the modern 40k settings. It's been adapted into almost a holy scripture, which ironically was built on flexibility and the ability to adapt, and is now really stringently followed by a lot of chapters, albeit but not all of them. As a Black Templars fan, we're not Codex compliant, so you can see how the actions of Thiel have really impacted all the way through. Winston Churchill is still very much seen as a hero of the British Empire, of England and the UK, and forms a big part of the national identity here. So while his plan, I guess, wasn't executed, his impact is still very much felt, and he's still kind of seen as a talisman. While Aeonid Thiel probably isn't talked about as much in the 40k setting, his red helmet is still a feature on the cover of everything that comes out of GW, and the Ultramarines, the poster boys of the 40k setting. His impact certainly, and his impression has certainly lasted through to the 41st millennium and the setting that we all love today. Again, two very different characters, but massive impacts on the setting. Okay, that's all we've got time for today. I am experimenting with different productions, with different lengths, with different settings, so please continue to keep the comments coming down below. I really appreciate all of the feedback. It's been super helpful. To those of you that have reached out individually offering help, thank you so much. It means a lot. For you that are new, please hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel a lot. We're pushing to get to 1,000 quickly, so that hopefully I can start to do things like doing giveaways and supporting the community in more ways than just pushing out videos. I'm also going to try and start doing some live streams here soon. So thank you. I hope you've enjoyed. I look forward to catching you in the next History of the Far Future. But until then, ka kite.